Learn English through story. A whisper of sin. The night carried the weight of secrets. Beneath the glow of the gas lamps lining the cobbled streets, Mariana walked with measured steps, the hem of her dark velvet dress brushing against the damp ground. The air was thick with the scent of rain and the faintest trace of lilacs, a fragrance that always reminded her of the past, of promises whispered in the dark and sins that refused to be buried. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she approached the grand estate at the edge of the city. The house loomed before her, its towering facade a relic of another era, its stone walls whispering stories of the generations that had passed through its halls. Tonight, it would bear witness to yet another tale, one of temptation, betrayal, and the cost of desire. Mariana had been warned, many times, by those who claimed to care for her, by those who envied her, and by those who saw too much. But warnings had never been enough to change the course of a heart already set adrift. She knew what waited for her inside that house. She knew the danger, the risk, the exquisite pain that would come with stepping through those doors. Yet, she knocked. The butler, a man with weary eyes and a gaze that lingered, just long enough to suggest he knew why she had come, opened the door without a word. He stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The scent of burning wood and aged wine filled the grand foyer. A crystal chandelier cast flickering light across the marble floor, illuminating the figure at the top of the staircase. Lucien Valcourt, a name that dripped from lips like honey, that carried with it the weight of whispered scandals and dangerous liaisons. He descended slowly, each step deliberate, his dark gaze never leaving hers. "You came," he murmured, his voice a caress against the silence. "I always do," she replied, knowing it was the truth, knowing it was a sin she would commit again and again. He reached her, fingers brushing the back of her hand, his touch both a promise and a curse. "Then let the night begin," he whispered, leading her deeper into the house, into the shadows where sins were born, and virtue was but a forgotten whisper. The world outside ceased to exist the moment. Mariana surrendered to Lucien's touch. His lips met hers with a slow, deliberate hunger, as if he was savoring the moment, as if he knew the cost of what they were doing, and reveled in it. The fire crackled beside them, its heat a mere shadow of the fire igniting between them. Mariana's breath hitched as Lucien's hands traced the curve of her waist, pulling her closer, deeper into his orbit. She knew this was folly. She knew the price of indulgence, the weight of whispered sins that could ruin a woman like her. That logic had long since abandoned her in his presence. Lucien was not a man who begged, nor one who pleaded. He was a man who took, who claimed, who wielded his power as effortlessly as he breathed. And yet there was something in the way his hands lingered on her skin, something in the way he whispered her name against her throat, that made her wonder, was she the one ensnaring him? The thought vanished the moment he pulled back, his dark gaze studying her. "You're trembling again." Mariana forced herself to smile. "Perhaps I'm simply cold." Lucien chuckled, low and rich. "Liar." She turned away, walking toward the grand window that overlooked the city below. From here, she could see the winding streets, the distant lanterns glowing like fallen stars. Somewhere out there, a different life awaited her. Life where she was not bound to the dangerous waltz of secrets and desire. But she did not want that life. Lucien appeared behind her, his presence a shadow she could not escape. He traced a finger down her arm, sending shivers through her. "What is it, Mariana? Tell me what plagues that beautiful mind of yours." She hesitated. How could she explain it? The fear of being caught? The thrill of knowing they were already too deep? The inevitability of their destruction? Instead, she asked, "Do you ever regret it?" Lucian stilled. Regret? This. She gestured between them. Us. He was silent for a moment. Then he leaned in, his lips ghosting against the shell of her ear. Regret is for those who wish they had never tasted the fruit. His fingers tightened around her wrist. "And you, my love, have already taken a bite." Mariana exhaled shakily. It was true. There was no undoing what had been done. No going back to the woman she was before Lucien Valcourt. She turned in his grasp, her fingers brushing against the fine fabric of his waistcoat. "Then what happens when the world comes for us?" Lucian smiled, slow and dangerous. "Then let it come." But Mariana knew better. The world had no mercy for lovers who danced too close to the fire. And neither did fate. The weight of his words settled in Mariana's chest. A whisper of something inevitable, something cruel. Then let it come. As if fate were a storm they could weather. As if the world had ever been kind to lovers like them. Lucian took her hand, guiding her to the chaise near the fire. The room felt suffocating, rich with the scent of wine and burning wood, the ghost of his touch still lingering on her skin. She wanted to believe in his certainty, to believe that their sins could be hidden beneath silk sheets and stolen whispers, that the city was watching. The city was always watching. He poured another glass of wine, his fingers steady, his expression unreadable. "You fear the world's judgment," he mused, tilting the glass toward her. "But tell me, Mariana, have they not already condemned you?" She accepted the drink, though her hands were not as steady as his. "Not yet." Lucian smirked. "Not yet," he echoed, swirling the deep red liquid in his glass. "But they will." Mariana looked away. She had spent her life balancing on the edge of propriety, wearing her virtue like a mask, knowing one misstep would send her tumbling into ruin. And yet she had chosen this, chosen him. Lucien watched her in silence, as if tracing the thoughts unraveling in her mind. "There is still time," he said, softer now, "if you wish to walk away." A lie. They both knew she would not. She set her glass down and met his gaze. "You speak as if the choice is mine alone." Lucian leaned back, his smile fading. "You're right." He reached for her, his fingers brushing her wrist, his touch feather-light yet unyielding. Perhaps the choice was never ours to begin with. Mariana shivered, not from the cold, but from the truth that lay between them. Their love, if it could be called that, was a force neither of them could control, a hunger that had consumed them long before they had the sense to resist it. Lucian sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "Do you ever wonder," he murmured, "what might have been if we had met differently? A life without secrets. A life where they were not forced to hide behind locked doors and whispered promises." Mariana's lips parted, but no words came. What was the use of longing for something that could never be? Lucian seemed to understand. He reached for her again, and this time she did not pull away. "Then let's not waste what little time we have," he whispered. And so they sank into the night, into the warmth of the fire, into each other knowing that dawn would bring consequences neither of them could escape, because the world was watching, and the world would not forgive. The morning arrived with an unsettling stillness, the kind that came before a storm. Mariana stirred beneath the silk sheets, her body still tangled with the remnants of the night before. The scent of Lucien lingered in the space around her, a mix of spice, smoke, and something unmistakably his. She reached for him instinctively, but the bed beside her was cold. She sat up, the silk pooling around her waist, and listened. The house was quiet, too quiet. The fire had burned down to embers, the dim light casting restless shadows against the walls. A whisper of unease coiled around her spine. She slipped from the bed, pulling a robe over her bare shoulders, and padded to the door. The corridor stretched out before her, its high ceilings and dark wood paneling feeling more ominous in the daylight. Lucien was nowhere in sight. Descending the grand staircase, she found the butler waiting at the foot of the stairs, his hands clasped before him. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made her stomach tighten. "Where is he?" she asked. The butler hesitated. Mr. Valcourt had an urgent matter to attend to. Mariana exhaled, the words doing little to soothe the unease gnawing at her. Lucien was a man of secrets, but he had never disappeared without a word before. She moved past the butler and into the drawing room, where last night's wine still sat untouched on the table. The room felt different now, colder, emptier. She crossed the space, pressing her fingers against the glass, tracing the faint condensation left behind by the night's chill. Outside, the city stretched beneath a pale sky, its streets alive with murmurs and movement. The world was waking up, and with it, the whispers she had been trying to ignore. A knock at the front door shattered the silence. The butler stiffened. Mariana turned just as he moved to answer it. The moment the door swung open, she knew. Two men stood on the threshold, their presence a stark contrast to the warmth of the house. Their coats were heavy, their gazes sharper than they needed to be. "Miss DeLuca?" one of them asked. Her breath caught. The weight of her family name, once a shield, now felt like a noose around her throat. "Yes," she said carefully. The man reached into his coat, producing a folded letter. "A word of caution, miss," he said, his voice low. "Your name has been spoken in rooms it does not belong." Mariana's fingers curled around the letter before she even processed what he had said. "What do you mean?" The man studied her for a moment, then shook his head. "Not here." His gaze flickered past her, deeper into the house. "Not with him watching." "Lucien." The second man spoke for the first time. "If you value your future, Miss DeLuca, you will think carefully about the company you keep." And then they were gone, their footsteps fading into the morning light. Mariana stood frozen in the doorway, the letter burning in her grasp. The butler cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly. "Would you like me to?" "No." Her voice was steady, though she did not feel steady at all. "I will handle it." She stepped back into the drawing room and unfolded the letter with careful fingers. The paper was crisp, the ink dark. The words, however, were what stole the breath from her lungs. "There are debts that cannot be paid with silver, and sins that will not be forgiven." Mariana's grip tightened. The city had spoken, and the reckoning had begun. Mariana stared at the letter, the inked words searing into her mind. The weight of their meaning pressed against her ribs, suffocating, undeniable. She had known this moment would come. Whispers had a way of growing into shouts. And now, it seemed, The world was no longer content to merely talk behind her back. She refolded the letter with slow, deliberate fingers, setting it down beside the untouched glass of wine. Outside, the city continued its restless hum, oblivious to the storm brewing within her. The butler lingered by the door, waiting. He had served the Valcourt estate long enough to know when to speak and when to remain silent. Mariana turned to him, her voice measured. "When did he leave?" "Before sunrise, miss." She nodded, unsurprised. Lucien had always been a creature of the night, slipping through the cracks of dawn like a ghost. Still, something about his absence felt wrong, as if he had known what was coming, as if he had left her to face it alone. "Did he leave a message?" she asked. The butler hesitated, then stepped forward and placed a small folded note on the table beside the letter. She reached for it, her pulse quickening as she unfolded the thick parchment. "Do not be afraid." No signature, no explanation. Mariana let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening around the note. The words were a command, not a comfort. Lucien knew something he had not told her. She turned back to the butler. "Prepare the carriage." His brows lifted slightly, but he did not question her. "Of course, miss. Shall I ask where you wish to go?" She hesitated for only a moment. Then, with the letter still burning in her palm, she answered, "The Valcourt estate." The butler nodded and disappeared down the corridor. Mariana remained standing in the quiet room, her heart pounding beneath the layers of silk and lace. The city had spoken, but Lucien Valcourt owed her an answer. The carriage ride was slow, each turn of the wheels echoing against the damp cobbled streets. Mariana kept the curtains drawn, unwilling to meet the gazes of the watchful city. The letter lay in her lap, folded neatly, its weight far heavier than paper should be. Lucien's estate rose from the mist like something carved from shadow, its dark stone facade standing defiant against the creeping daylight. The iron gates opened at her approach, as if expecting her. As if he was expecting her. The butler met her at the entrance, bowing slightly. "Mr. Valcourt is in the study." She did not wait for him to lead her. She knew the way. The study doors were ajar, candlelight spilling into the dim hallway. Mariana stepped inside. Lucien stood by the fireplace, one hand resting against the mantel, the other holding a glass of whiskey. He did not turn as she entered. "You received a letter," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. Lucien exhaled, a slow, measured sound. "I did." She stepped closer, the fire casting golden shadows across his face. "And yet you left." Now he turned, his gaze unreadable. "I was handling it." Mariana let out a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Handling it," she repeated. "Is that what you call running?" Lucien's jaw tensed. "I do not run." "Then tell me the truth." She held up the letter. "Who sent this?" He watched her for a long moment before setting his glass down with deliberate care. "Someone who knows that we have gone too far," he said. The word sent a shiver through her. "Too far?" she echoed. "And who decides that?" Lucien stepped closer, his fingers grazing the letter in her hand before brushing against her wrist. "The world does," he murmured. Mariana swallowed. "And do you fear it?" Lucien smiled, then slow, knowing. "No," he whispered. "But I fear losing you." The fire crackled between them, filling the silence with its quiet hunger. Mariana exhaled, her anger waning. replaced by something darker, something dangerous. "We are past the point of fear, Lucian," she murmured. "The city has spoken. What will you do?" Lucian studied her, his gaze shadowed. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he took the letter from her fingers and tossed it into the fire. It curled and blackened, the ink vanishing into smoke. Lucian reached for her, his hands steady, his voice quiet but firm. "I will not let them take you from me." Mariana shivered, not from fear, but from the terrifying certainty that she believed him. Because Lucian Valcourt was not a man who surrendered. And now neither was she. The flames devoured the letter, its edges curling inward like dying petals before vanishing into embers. The words, those damning, threatening words, were gone, but their meaning lingered. Mariana watched as the last trace of ink turned to smoke, a whisper of warning erased by fire. Yet, even as the letter burned, she knew its message would not be so easily undone. She turned to Lucien, his face half lit by the glow of the hearth. Shadows stretched across his sharp features, carving him into something almost inhuman, something untouchable. But she had touched him. She had tasted him. And now, she was entangled in his world, a world where love was laced with danger, where whispers carried weight, where power and ruin walked hand in hand. "You cannot burn away a threat," she murmured. Lucian exhaled, his gaze never leaving hers. "No," he admitted, "but I can erase the hand that wrote it." A chill ran through her, not from fear, but from the realization of what he was willing to do, what he would do. She had known, hadn't she? Known that Lucian Valcourt was not a man who waited for the world to act. He moved the world, bent it to his will. "Who sent it?" she asked, her voice steady. Lucian turned, retrieving his glass of whiskey, the movement slow, controlled. "Does it matter?" Mariana stepped forward. "It does if they are watching us. They have always been watching us." He took a sip, his fingers tightening around the glass. "But this is not just about whispers anymore." She swallowed, waiting. Lucian set his drink down, his expression unreadable. "There are those who believe your name should not be spoken alongside mine, that your place is elsewhere, with a safer man, a proper man." His lips curled, mocking the very idea. "And then there are those who would rather see you fall than see you with me at all." Mariana's pulse quickened. "And which of them sent this?" Lucian tilted his head, considering. "I have my suspicions." "Tell me." His dark eyes met hers, searching. For what? She didn't know. Permission? Doubt? "You already know the answer, Mariana," he murmured. She inhaled sharply, her mind racing. The world she had tried to outrun the expectations, the rigid lines of propriety, the weight of her name, it had never truly let her go. Her father. Mariana turned away, pressing a hand to her temple. "He wouldn't." Lucian laughed softly, but there was no amusement in it. "He would." He stepped behind her, his fingers grazing her shoulder. A touch meant to steady, to claim. "And he has." She clenched her jaw. "Then what happens now?" Lucian leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "Now?" His voice was silk over steel. "Now, we decide how far we are willing to go." A dangerous thrill coursed through her. She had spent her life bound by invisible chains, told where to stand, what to say, who to be. But here, in this moment, with Lucian's shadow entwined with hers. She felt something else entirely. She felt free. Mariana turned to face him, her pulse a steady drumbeat against her ribs. "And if I say I will not be taken from you?" Lucian's smile was slow, dark. "Then I will make sure they never try again." The promise was not poetic. It was not spoken in soft words or wistful longing. It was absolute. Mariana exhaled, her decision made. "Then let them come," she whispered. Lucian lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her palm. "They will regret it." And she believed him, because the city had spoken. But now, so had she. And the war had begun. The night crept in like a thief, swallowing the last traces of daylight. Mariana couldn't sleep. The events of the day, the man's visit, the weight of her decisions, all swirled in her mind, leaving her restless, unsettled. She moved through the estate like a ghost, her footsteps silent on the cold marble floors. The house seemed so vast and empty now, the walls echoing with memories she no longer knew how to reconcile. She had chosen a path, and there was no turning back. But the gravity of her choice was settling in. She was entwined with Lucian Valcourt, and now her fate was bound to his. And if what that man had said was true, if the city and its people were watching, waiting for her to falter, she had no idea how much longer she could stand. She paused in front of a large mirror, taking in her reflection. There was strength in her eyes now, a new hardness to her features. She had never seen herself like this more than a daughter, more than a woman constrained by her name. This was something else entirely. A knock at the door startled her. "Mr. Luca?" The voice was familiar, soft, but carrying a note of tension she hadn't noticed before. It was the butler again. "Yes," she replied, turning away from the mirror. The door opened slightly, and his face appeared in the gap. His expression was neutral, but his eyes betrayed his concern. "Mr. Valcourt has returned," he said quietly. "He wishes to speak with you." Mariana's heart skipped a beat, and she felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread. Lucian had always been a force in her life, and now, more than ever, she felt his pull. She couldn't explain it, but she knew. Whatever happened next, she was no longer the same woman she had been. "Send him in," she said, her voice steady despite the churn of emotions within her. The butler nodded and stepped away. Moments later, Lucian entered, his presence filling the room. He was just as commanding as ever, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her heart race. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he simply stood there, watching her. Mariana waited, refusing to let her anxiety show. There were things between them, things left, unsaid, but she knew. It couldn't be ignored any longer. The choices they had made, the paths they had crossed, had brought them here. She was no longer the sheltered woman she had once been. "Mariana," Lucian finally said, his voice low, almost tender. He stepped closer, but there was something different in his eyes now. "I never wanted this for you." Her breath caught, but she refused to show weakness. "You never wanted this. Then why push me into it?" He ran a hand through his hair, the frustration evident in his posture. "Because I could see what was coming, and I couldn't let you go, not when you were already a part of it. A part of me." The words hung in the air, heavy and pregnant with meaning. She felt a shiver run down her spine at his admission. There was no denying the bond between them. no escaping the attraction that had drawn her in like a moth to a flame. But what was it really? Was it love or something darker, more dangerous? "Lucien," she whispered, taking a step toward him, her voice soft. "We're already in too deep. The city won't let us go. They've already made their move. That man who came to see me." She hesitated. "He spoke of consequences." Lucian's eyes flashed, a dark gleam flickering in them. "And what did he offer you?" "A way out," she said, almost ashamed of how tempting it had sounded. "A choice, to leave you behind, to return to safety." His jaw clenched, and for a moment, he seemed to be weighing something inside himself. Then, he took a step closer to her, his gaze locking with hers. "Do you want that? To go back to safety?" he asked quietly, but the question was sharp, cutting through the air between them. She swallowed, feeling a knot tighten in her throat. "I want to survive," she said, the truth of it settling over her like a heavy cloak. "But at what cost? I don't know if I can keep doing this, Lucien. Keep living like this, caught in this web you've woven." He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his touch warm, grounding. "You don't have to do anything, Mariana. This is my fight, not yours. But you are already a part of it. You have always been a part of it." Her breath hitched and her heart pounded in her chest. The intensity in his gaze, the certainty in his voice, it was impossible to ignore. That beneath that certainty, there was a vulnerability she hadn't expected. Lucien Valcourt, the untouchable, the unyielding, was afraid. Afraid of losing her. "Then what?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happens now?" Lucien's eyes softened, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her close, as if to shield her from the world outside. "Now, we fight." Mariana closed her eyes, letting the warmth of his embrace seep into her bones. She had chosen this path. She had chosen him. And whatever came next, they would face it together. There was no turning back, no escape from the storm that was coming. The city was watching. Their enemies were closing in. But in this moment, in Lucien's arms, the world outside didn't matter. All that mattered was the fragile, dangerous bond they had forged, and the consequences that would follow. The days that followed felt like a slow march toward an inevitable confrontation. The city's pulse was changing, shifting under the weight of secrets and unspoken truths. Mariana could feel it, the tension in the air, the whispers that circled them like vultures waiting for a moment of weakness. But there was no turning back now. Lucien had made it clear. They were going to fight, and they were going to fight together. But as the days passed, Mariana's understanding of what that meant, what they were truly up against, began to crystallize. The threats were no longer just distant words on a letter or vague warnings from shadowy figures. They were tangible, real. It started with subtle things. A carriage driver who looked at her just a little too long. A servant who seemed to be watching her when she didn't notice. Even the birds in the garden, perched in the trees, felt like spies in waiting. The walls, once comforting and familiar, now felt oppressive, as though they were closing in on her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the orange glow bathed the room in warmth, Lucien finally spoke of the danger in clear terms. They were in his study, the same room where they had first met, the walls lined with books and heavy leather chairs. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light before he handed one to her. She accepted it without thinking, the glass cool in her hand. I've made arrangements, Lucian said, sitting down behind his desk, the lines of his face hardening with an intensity that sent a chill through her. But it's not enough. We're running out of time. Arrangements? Mariana asked, her voice low. She'd sensed that something was coming, but now the reality of his plan seemed more terrifying than anything she had imagined. Lucian leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk as he met her gaze. The city is a network, Mariana, a web of power and influence. And not all of it is on our side. Your father, he trailed off, a dark shadow passing over his features. He's been playing a dangerous game for years. I'm not the only one who's watching you. Mariana's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Who else is involved? Lucian's eyes darkened, and his lips curled into something between a grimace and a smile. A man named Giovanni Bellini. He's been in your father's pocket for years. One of the most powerful men in this city. He's been waiting for the right moment to strike. Bellini? Mariana's voice faltered as she recognized the name. He was the one her father had always spoken about in hushed tones. The man who was rumored to have more influence than half the city's leaders combined. What does he want? Lucian's gaze hardened. He wants you, and he'll stop at nothing to get you. Mariana felt a cold shiver run through her. Why me? Lucian stood up, walking around the desk to stand beside her. He didn't touch her, but the intensity of his presence felt like an unspoken claim. Because you're the key. You are your father's legacy, his blood, his power. If Bellini can control you, he controls everything. He paused, his voice lowering to a near whisper. And if he takes you, Mariana, there's no telling what he'll do to break you. The weight of his words settled over her, like a suffocating cloud. She wanted to deny it, to say that it wasn't true, that she was just a woman, an innocent caught in the middle, that she knew better now. She knew that true power was not just a matter of wealth or influence. It was the ability to control another person, to shape their fate. And Bellini wanted that power. He wanted her. She clenched her fists, her grip tightening around the glass in her hand. So what do we do now? Lucian's eyes softened, but there was no trace of mercy in his expression. We prepare. We fight. We destroy anyone who tries to take you from me. For the first time, Mariana felt the full weight of what they were about to face. This wasn't a simple fight for survival. This was a battle for their very souls. And Lucian was ready to burn the world down to protect her. But was she ready to burn it down with him? The question lingered in the air between them, but neither of them spoke it aloud. The choice, for now, was unspoken. Mariana could feel the tension between them building, an unbreakable bond forged not in love, but in something darker, something necessary. As the night stretched on, Mariana sat in the quiet, thinking of what Lucian had said. Giovanni Bellini, her father's shadow, and the city, its web of lies, its dirty deals, its unspoken rules. The lines had been drawn, and they were the ones caught in the center. At that moment, she realized the truth. There would be no escape from this world. Not now. Not ever. She stood up, walking toward Lucian, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what she was about to commit herself to. Lucian, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. What if I can't do it? He looked up, his gaze softening as he reached out to touch her cheek. You're stronger than you think, and we're in this together. No one can take you from me, not while I'm still breathing. His words were a promise, but also a warning. A promise that nothing would break them apart. And a warning that once they crossed the line, there would be no turning back. The stakes were rising. The web was closing in around them, tightening with every step they took. Bellini was moving closer, and with him, the rest of the city's shadows. But in the dark, there was only one truth left for Mariana. She had chosen this life, and she would stand beside Lucian, even if it meant facing the very demons she had tried to outrun. The game was on. The days blurred into nights, and the tension between Lucian and Mariana grew heavier with each passing hour. Every moment felt like a countdown, the air thick with anticipation, as they prepared for the inevitable confrontation with Giovanni Bellini. It was no longer a matter of if he would strike, but when. Lucian had been working in the shadows, meeting with his most trusted allies, orchestrating moves across the city's underworld. Mariana, on the other hand, found herself increasingly isolated, caught between her growing attachment to Lucian and the haunting weight of her family's legacy. Every corner of the house seemed to carry whispers of her father's influence, a shadow she couldn't escape. One evening, as the last light of the day slipped through the curtains, Mariana stood at the window, watching the city below. The skyline was a silhouette of darkened towers, the streets alive with movement, but she felt detached from it all. Her life, her choices were no longer hers to control. Everything had shifted the moment Lucian entered her world, and now even the ground beneath her seemed uncertain. A soft knock on the door broke her thoughts. She turned to find Lucian standing in the doorway, his figure dark against the light from the hallway. His gaze was intense, the lines of his face etched with a weariness that only deepened her concern. "Mariana," he said, his voice low. "We need to talk." Her heart skipped a beat, but she nodded, setting aside the glass of wine she had been nursing. "What's happened?" she asked, already knowing the answer. The look on his face said everything she needed to know. Lucian stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "Bellini's men are close. They've made their move." His eyes never left hers, and there was a coldness in his voice that sent a shiver down her spine. "This isn't just about power anymore, Mariana. It's personal." A chill spread through her chest. "Personal?" she echoed, her voice faltering. He nodded. "He's taken your father. Or rather, he's holding him. He's trying to force your hand." Mariana's breath caught in her throat. "My father?" The words felt foreign on her tongue. She hadn't spoken to him in weeks, hadn't seen him in even longer, but she had never imagined he could be taken so easily, so recklessly. Lucian moved closer, his presence filling the space between them. "Bellini knows that if he can get to your father, he can control you. He'll use him to break you, Mariana. And we can't afford that." His tone was fierce, almost desperate. "I'm not going to let him do this. Not to you. Not to us." The weight of his words pressed heavily against her chest, but she couldn't bring herself to look away from him. He was right. This wasn't just about her father. It was about everything that had been set in motion, everything that had led to this point. Bellini had made it personal, and now the stakes were higher than ever. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady, even though her mind was spinning. Lucian took a deep breath, his expression darkening as he looked at her. "We fight back. We take control of the situation before Bellini has a chance to break us." "And my father?" Her voice trembled slightly. betraying the fear she felt. What about him? We'll get him back, Lucian said firmly. We have to. But first, we need to eliminate the threat Bellini poses. Once he realizes we're not afraid of him, we'll be able to leverage that power against him. Mariana nodded, though her heart was heavy with uncertainty. The thought of using her father as leverage, of making him a pawn in this ruthless game, unsettled her more than she cared to admit. But she knew that Lucian was right. This was war. There would be no room for mercy, no room for hesitation. How? She asked, her voice quiet. How do we stop Bellini? Lucian's eyes hardened, a cold fire flickering in their depths. We hit him where it hurts. We dismantle his empire, his network, piece by piece. We take out his allies, his businesses, his men. Once we've done that, he'll have no choice but to negotiate. He paused, looking at her intently. But this isn't going to be easy, Mariana. Once we go down this path, there's no going back. We're crossing a line, and once it's crossed, there's no returning to the life we knew. Mariana swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She was no stranger to the darkness of the world Lucian inhabited. But now, more than ever, it felt like the walls were closing in. Her father, her family, Bellini. There was no escape from it anymore. She was already too far gone. I know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But we have no choice, do we? Lucian stepped closer, his hands gripping her arms gently but firmly. No, we don't. His gaze softened, the intensity in his eyes still burning. But there was something else there now, something deeper. But I won't let you face this alone. We fight this together, Mariana. No matter what happens, we face it together. Her heart ached, the weight of his promise both a comfort and a curse. She had already given herself to him, body and soul, and now there was no way out, no safe corner to hide in. She had chosen her path, and with that choice, she had stepped into a war that would shape her future forever. Together, she repeated softly, the word feeling like both a declaration and a plea. Lucian gave a small nod, his expression grave. Prepare yourself. It won't be long now. Bellini won't wait much longer. Mariana nodded, her resolve hardening. She didn't know what the future held, or how far Lucian was willing to go to protect her. But she knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened, they would face it together. A night stretched on, the shadows in the room growing longer as the two of them stood, united in their purpose. The city outside was unaware of the storm that was about to descend upon it. But for Mariana and Lucian, the battle had already begun. The following days passed in a haze of urgency and fear. Lucian was a man driven, consumed by the need to protect Mariana and destroy their enemies. He had always operated in the shadows, but now, with her life hanging in the balance, he moved with a new ferocity. Every decision was calculated, every step deliberate. But the weight of it all pressed heavily on Mariana's shoulders as well. She could feel the pull of the danger closing in around them, the relentless web of lies tightening, the noose of power that Bellini had already begun to tighten. She spent her days in the house, pacing the corridors, her mind racing with the plans Lucian was drawing up. At night she would lie awake, listening to the sounds of the city outside, knowing that Bellini's men were somewhere in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But Lucian was always there, always by her side. His presence a constant reassurance and a constant reminder of the darkness they had stepped into. One evening, as the golden hues of dusk faded into the ink of night, Lucian called for a meeting in the study. He had gathered a small group of trusted allies, men and women who were loyal to him and who understood the stakes. Mariana stood at the edge of the room, watching as Lucian laid out a map of the city, outlining the key players in Bellini's operation. The walls felt like they were closing in around her as she listened to the detailed plans, the strategies, the names of people who could be enemies or allies depending on which side they chose. She felt like an outsider in the room, but Lucian had insisted she be there. "You're part of this," he had said earlier. "There's no going back, and I need you to understand what we're up against." As the meeting continued, Mariana's mind drifted, her thoughts consumed by the strange mix of emotions churning inside her: fear, anger, and, above all, a deep, gnawing uncertainty. Lucian had made it clear this was their fight. But did she truly belong in this world, with these people, this violence? Did she even have the right to fight beside him? A soft tap on the door broke her thoughts, and Lucian's trusted lieutenant, a sharp-eyed woman named Isabel, stepped into the room, her face grim. "Mr. Valcourt," she said, her voice low but urgent. "It's Bellini. He's made his move." Mariana's breath caught in her chest. She had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, the weight of it all felt too much to bear. Lucian didn't hesitate. His gaze hardened, the calm determination in his eyes making it clear that he had been expecting this. "Where is he?" Lucian asked, his voice cold, his presence commanding. "He's taken action against some of our people," Isabel replied. "We need to respond immediately." Lucian turned to face Mariana, his eyes softening just for a moment before he masked his emotions again. "Stay here," he said firmly. "It's too dangerous. I'll take care of this." For a moment, Mariana wanted to argue, to tell him that she could fight too. But something in his expression, the way he held himself so fiercely protective, so determined, silenced her. She knew he was right. There was no place for her on the front lines of this war. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she stepped toward him. Lucian paused, his hand brushing against her cheek, his touch fleeting but full of promise. "I will. I promise you that." And with that he was gone. The next few hours passed like an eternity. Mariana waited, her mind racing, her pulse quickening with every passing minute. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing him, even as he fought to protect her. It was a feeling that had been growing steadily over the past weeks, this sense of dread, of knowing that each choice they made, each step they took, led them further into the abyss. She couldn't escape it, and no matter how much she tried to push it aside, the truth remained. She was falling deeper into the world Lucian had created, and there was no coming back. The sounds of chaos outside the estate began to reach her ears. The distant thud of gunshots, the muffled shouts of men, the unmistakable tension in the air. It was all escalating too quickly. Mariana's hand tightened around the edges of the table as she stood there, helpless. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door opened again. But this time, It wasn't Lucien. It was Isabel. Her face pale, her breath ragged from running. "He's gone," Isabel said, her voice shaking, her eyes wide with fear. Mariana's heart dropped. "Gone," she repeated, her voice hollow. "What do you mean gone?" "We were ambushed," Isabel explained, her voice tight with anger and fear. "Lucien was caught off guard. Bellini's men. They took him." The words hit Mariana like a physical blow. She could barely breathe, barely comprehend what she had just heard. Lucien, the man she had grown to trust and love, the man who had vowed to protect her, was now in the hands of their enemy. "No," Mariana's voice broke, her knees giving out beneath her as she collapsed into the nearest chair. "No, this can't be happening." Isabel knelt beside her, gripping her arms to steady her. "We need to act fast," she urged, her eyes wild with determination. "If we don't, they'll break him, and Bellini won't stop until he's destroyed everything you care about." Tears welled up in Mariana's eyes, her vision blurring as the weight of the situation settled over her like a crushing wave. Her father, Lucien, all of it was slipping away. How had things gone so wrong so quickly? But amidst the fear and despair, one thing was clear to her. She couldn't let Lucien suffer. She couldn't let Bellini win. Not like this. With trembling hands, Mariana wiped away the tears and looked up at Isabel, her expression hardening. "Get me out of here. I'm going to save him." The battle for control, for love, and for power had begun. Mariana was no longer a passive observer. She was a player in this deadly game, and she was willing to do whatever it took to save Lucien, even if it meant losing herself in the process. Mariana didn't waste a second more. The moment Isabel spoke those chilling words, her mind snapped into action. She wasn't a pawn anymore, not someone who could simply wait and let Lucien fight her battles. She was his equal, and she would prove it. Without another word, she stood, her legs unsteady but determined. "Gather the others. We're going after him." Isabel looked at her, stunned for a moment, before nodding and rushing out of the room. Mariana's thoughts raced as she made her way toward the door, her hands shaking, her pulse a steady drumbeat of urgency. The city outside was like a jungle, a vast and dangerous expanse full of traps and threats. But Mariana knew it intimately. She had grown up in its shadows, had learned how to navigate its streets, its underworld. Lucien had taught her much about strategy, but now she was going to teach herself how to survive. The air was thick with tension as Isabel and the rest of Lucien's trusted allies prepared to move out. Mariana stood at the center of the room, her expression unreadable, her mind focused solely on what lay ahead. She knew that every decision she made in the coming hours could be the difference between life and death, not just for Lucien, but for everyone she had come to care about. "Are you sure about this?" Isabel asked, her voice laced with concern. "This is Bellini's territory. We're walking into the lion's den." Mariana's eyes never wavered. "I'm not asking for your permission," she said coldly. "I'm telling you what we're going to do. Get in, get Lucien, and get out. We don't have time for hesitation." Isabel nodded sharply, her lips pressing into a thin line. Understood. Mariana had no time to linger on doubts. The world outside was closing in on them, the very foundations of her life shaking beneath her feet. She had never thought she would find herself in a situation like this, never thought she would be the one to fight, to make choices that could determine the fate of everything. But here she was. Her mind turned to Lucien. The thought of him being in Bellini's hands, tortured or worse, made her heart tighten in her chest. What could Bellini do to him? What had he already done? No matter what happened next, Mariana knew there would be no returning to the innocence of her former life. This was the point of no return. The plan was simple, almost too simple. Mariana didn't believe in complexity anymore. Everything had to be direct and ruthless. As they approached Bellini's compound, the night seemed to close in around them, the city's lights fading as they moved deeper into enemy territory. The compound was well guarded, a fortress on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by high walls, security cameras, and guards posted at every possible entrance. But Mariana had always known how to use her surroundings to her advantage. She knew where the weak points were. She had once heard Lucien say, "No fortress is impenetrable." Only underestimated. That's what this would be. Bellini's men thought they had control over everything, but Mariana had learned to fight in ways they couldn't anticipate. "I'll take the east side," Mariana said to Isabel as they approached the compound's perimeter. "You take the west. We'll meet inside." Isabel looked reluctant but didn't argue. "Stay safe." "You too." They parted ways, moving swiftly and silently, their footsteps muffled against the wet ground. The darkened streets were their allies, the shadows concealing them as they approached the compound. Mariana felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, her focus sharp as she spotted the first guard, a man walking patrol with a heavy rifle slung over his shoulder. With the precision of someone who had lived in the world of danger all her life, Mariana moved quickly, slipping behind him and striking him in a swift, calculated motion. The man crumpled to the ground without a sound. She stripped him of his radio and earpiece, using them to blend in with the compound's security system. Everything about this mission felt familiar, as if it were a part of her. She moved with a confidence that shocked even her, her steps sure as she entered the compound undetected. Minutes later, she found herself inside the heart of Bellini's lair, a vast, cold building that smelled of damp concrete and iron. The sounds of muffled voices echoed from deeper within, and Mariana moved cautiously, every instinct alive as she honed in on the location of Lucien. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she pushed it aside. Lucien. She needed to find him. The hallway stretched out before her, dimly lit and empty. She pressed herself against the walls, every sense heightened, the feeling of being hunted growing stronger with each step. The security cameras had been neutralized, but she still had to be careful. One wrong move and everything could go wrong. She reached a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar. She could hear low voices, the unmistakable tone of Bellini's men. Her breath hitched. Lucien's voice was among them. "Please," he was saying. His voice was hoarse, strained, but unmistakable. "You don't have to do this." Mariana's heart clenched. Lucien, she thought. She was so close. She drew a knife from her belt, the cold steel a reminder of what was at stake. With a swift motion, she pushed the door open just enough to slip through, her body a shadow among shadows. Inside, Lucien was chained to a metal chair, bruised and bloodied, but still very much alive. He met her eyes across the room. his gaze dark but filled with something else: recognition. Relief. "Mariana," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Before she could step toward him, a voice rang out from the other side of the room. Well, what do we have here?" "Bellini." He stepped from the shadows, his presence like a predator's, looming over them. His smile was cold, calculating. "I see Lucian has a new protector," he said, his voice oozing with malice. "How touching." Mariana froze, her hand tightening around the handle of her knife. This was it. The moment she had feared, and the moment she had waited for. There would be no turning back now. Bellini's men flanked him, but she knew that Lucien was the one she had to save. No matter what, she wouldn't let him fall into Bellini's hands. "Not like this. I've come for him," Mariana said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "And you're not stopping me." The standoff was set. Now, in the heart of Bellini's lair, Mariana must make her final choice: fight her way out or risk everything to save Lucien. The tension is thick, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Mariana and Lucien stood at the threshold of the safe house, the quiet of the early morning enveloping them as they caught their breath. They had barely escaped Bellini's grasp, but they knew this was only the beginning. The true battle was still ahead. Lucien's gaze was steady, though his body still trembled with exhaustion from the brutal ordeal. Mariana could see the toll it had taken on him, but there was no time for rest. Bellini would never stop until he had them both, and they couldn't afford to wait. "We need to plan our next move," Mariana said, her voice resolute. "We can't keep running forever." Lucien nodded, his eyes dark with the weight of their situation. "Bellini won't let us go easily, but we'll find a way to end this. For good." Mariana moved to the small table in the corner of the room, her mind already working through their options. They needed to know more about Bellini's next steps, his weaknesses, his allies, anything that could give them an edge. Time was running out, and every moment spent in uncertainty could be their last. Isabel entered the room, her expression grim but determined. "I've been checking our routes. Bellini's men are still searching for us, but they don't know where we're hiding yet. We have some time." "That's not enough," Mariana said. "We need more than just time. We need a plan. Something that will ensure we take him down once and for all." Lucien spoke up, his voice steady despite the fatigue. "We know his territory better than anyone. He's hiding behind layers of security and power, but he's not invincible. We've seen his cracks. Now we just have to exploit them." Isabel nodded. "I've got connections. People who know the inner workings of Bellini's empire. If we can get to them, we might have the leverage we need." Mariana turned toward Lucien, her eyes meeting his. "We don't have the luxury of waiting. We have to act before Bellini can strike first." Lucien took a deep breath, his face hardening with resolve. "Then we'll make sure he doesn't get the chance. We end this now together." The plan was simple but risky. They would use the element of surprise, slipping past Bellini's defenses and striking where he least expected it. With Isabel's connections, they could gain access to vital information about Bellini's operations, and from there, they could make their move. As the hours passed, the three of them worked tirelessly, preparing for the next phase of their mission. They knew the risks. They were walking into the lion's den, and there was no guarantee they would make it out alive. But they had no choice. For too long, they had been pawns in Bellini's game. Now, It was their turn to take control. Night fell once again as they made their way toward Berlini's stronghold. The streets were eerily quiet, the hum of the city muffled by the weight of their purpose. The air was thick with tension, each step a reminder of the danger that loomed ahead. Mariana could feel the pressure mounting as they drew closer to their target. She had always known this day would come, the day when she would have to face Bellini and put an end to his reign of terror. But now, standing at the edge of everything she had fought for, the weight of the decision pressed heavily on her chest. She glanced at Lucien, who walked beside her, his jaw set in determination. Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. They had been through so much together, and now, in this final moment, they would face the ultimate challenge. They reached the compound's perimeter, a fortress guarded by high walls, security cameras, and armed guards. But they were prepared. They knew the layout, the weak points in the defenses. Mariana moved to the small table in the corner of the room, her mind already working through their options. They needed to know more about Bellini's next steps, his weaknesses, his allies, anything that could give them an edge. Time was running out, and every moment spent in uncertainty could be their last. Isabel entered the room, her expression grim but determined. "I've been checking our routes. Bellini's men are still searching for us, but they don't know where we're hiding yet. We have some time." "That's not enough," Mariana said. "We need more than just time. We need a plan, something that will ensure we take him down once and for all." Lucien spoke up, his voice steady despite the fatigue. "We know his territory better than anyone. He's hiding behind layers of security and power, but he's not invincible. We've seen his cracks. Now we just have to exploit them." Isabel nodded. "I've got connections. People who know the inner workings of Bellini's empire. If we can get to them, we might have the leverage we need." Mariana turned toward Lucien, her eyes meeting his. "We don't have the luxury of waiting. We have to act before Bellini can strike first." Lucien took a deep breath, his face hardening with resolve. "Then we'll make sure he doesn't get the chance. We end this now, together." The plan was simple but risky. They would use the element of surprise, slipping past Bellini's defenses and striking where he least expected it. With Isabel's connections, they could gain access to vital information about Bellini's operations, and from there, they could make their move. As the hours passed, the three of them worked tirelessly, preparing for the next phase of their mission. They knew the risks. They were walking into the lion's den, and there was no guarantee they would make it out alive. But they had no choice. For too long, they had been pawns in Bellini's game. Now, it was their turn to take control. Night fell once again as they made their way toward Bellini's stronghold. The streets were eerily quiet, the hum of the city muffled by the weight of their purpose. The air was thick with tension, each step a reminder of the danger that loomed ahead. Mariana could feel the pressure mounting as they drew closer to their target. She had always known this day would come, the day when she would have to face Bellini and put an end to his reign of terror. But now, standing at the edge of everything she had fought for, the weight of the decision pressed heavily on her chest. She glanced at Lucien, who walked beside her, his jaw set in determination. Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. They had been through so much together, and now, in this final moment, they would face the ultimate challenge. They reached the compound's perimeter, a fortress guarded by high walls, security cameras, and armed guards, that they were prepared. They knew the layout, the weak points in the defenses. This time, they wouldn't be caught off guard. With a mixture of stealth and precision, they infiltrated the compound, avoiding detection at every turn. Their movements were swift and calculated, each step leading them closer to their goal. As they navigated the maze of hallways and rooms, the air grew heavier with each passing second. Then, they found him. Bellini was in his office, surrounded by a handful of his most trusted men. But he wasn't expecting them. He hadn't prepared for the storm that was about to hit him. The confrontation was inevitable. Bellini stood, his eyes narrowing as he saw them enter. A cruel smile curled at the corner of his lips, but there was a flicker of unease behind his gaze. "You've come to finish what you started, haven't you?" Bellini said, his voice cold and menacing. "You think you can stop me? You're nothing. We're more than you'll ever understand." Mariana replied, her voice unwavering. "This ends now." Isabel's gun was trained on Bellini's men, while Mariana and Lucian moved to flank him. There was no room for hesitation. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Bellini's face twisted with fury as he stepped forward, but Mariana's resolve only strengthened. "You're done. Your reign of terror ends tonight." The final battle had begun. The struggle that followed was a blur of action and noise. The tension in the room was palpable, every movement charged with the weight of their purpose. Bellini fought back fiercely, but he was no match for the united strength of Mariana, Lucian, and Isabel. Every strike they made, every move they executed, was driven by the same goal to bring him down once and for all. In the end, it wasn't just the strength of their bodies that defeated Bellini. It was the strength of their will, their refusal to let him control their lives any longer. As Bellini fell, the room grew silent. The finality of it hit them all at once. They had won. The darkness that had loomed over them for so long was finally gone. But there was no celebration. There was no time for relief. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Bellini's empire might crumble, but there were others who would rise in his place. And the three of them knew that their fight would continue. But for now, they had reclaimed their lives. They had fought for each other, and together, they had emerged victorious. And as they left the compound behind, the city seemed a little less dark, a little less suffocating. For the first time in a long while, they could breathe again. The weight of victory was heavy, but for Mariana, Lucian, and Isabel, it was the beginning of a new chapter. The world around them was still filled with uncertainties. New dangers were already rising, and their fight was not truly over. Yet, there was a sense of peace, a fragile relief that came from knowing they had taken back control over their fates. The streets of the city, once a battleground of fear and suspicion, felt strangely quiet as they made their way through the back alleys, avoiding the main roads. The victory they had achieved was far-reaching, but there were no parades or celebrations. Instead, there was only a quiet understanding that they had all changed, and the world they had fought for would never be the same. As they walked, the trio remained close, united by the bond that had only deepened in the heat of battle. Lucian, though weary, moved with a steady determination. His expression was grim but resolute, as if the fight they just fought had strengthened his resolve to face whatever came next. Mariana walked beside him, her steps slower, more deliberate. The weight of everything they'd been through pressed heavily on her. But she was no longer burdened by fear. She had made it through, and they had all survived. Now, she could see a path forward, one that didn't depend on Bellini's empire or the shadows that had once loomed over them. Isabel, ever watchful, kept a pace ahead of them. She scanned the surroundings, her sharp eyes catching every movement in the corners of their vision. Despite the weight of their success, Isabel knew they couldn't afford to relax. Not yet. There would be those who would rise to take Bellini's place, and they would need to stay ahead of them. "We're not out of the woods yet," Isabel said, her voice low but firm. "Bellini's fall is just one battle in a larger war." Mariana nodded, glancing at Lucian. He met her gaze with a quiet understanding. "But we're ready now," she said. "We've taken the first step." Isabel gave a sharp nod. "Exactly. We know the darkness that lives in this city. We've seen what it's capable of. And now we know what we're up against." Their journey was far from over. But they were no longer just survivors, they were fighters. The pain they had endured, the losses they had suffered, had prepared them for whatever came next. They had survived Bellini's empire, and they would survive whatever arose in its place. Days passed, and the world outside continued as it always had. People went about their daily lives, unaware of the quiet revolution that had taken place behind the scenes. But for Mariana, Lucian, and Isabel, the fight never stopped. The walls that had once confined them now seemed like distant memories, and every new step forward was a reaffirmation of their will to live free from the chains of their past. Their efforts to dismantle Bellini's remaining influence began almost immediately. They worked tirelessly, gathering information, infiltrating key locations, and gaining the trust of those who had once been loyal to Bellini but had grown disillusioned with his reign. They were careful, patient, and strategic. Every move was calculated. It was during this time that Mariana truly realized the depth of her transformation. No longer was she the woman who had been trapped in the shadows of fear and submission. She was someone who had fought for her own survival, and in doing so, she had become something more, someone who could change the course of her life, and perhaps the life of others as well. Lucian, too, had found a new purpose. The man she had once known, broken and consumed by his past, had become someone she could rely on. In the aftermath of Bellini's fall, he had become the leader she had always known. He could be a man who had faced his demons and emerged stronger. And Isabel, ever the quiet strategist, had been the glue that held them together. She was the calm in the storm, the one who always thought 10 steps ahead. Her loyalty and sharp mind had been invaluable, and it became clear that without her, their success would have been impossible. One night, as they sat around a table in a small, dimly lit room in their new safe house, Lucien finally spoke what had been on his mind for days. "We've been running for so long, fighting for so much. But what comes next?" he asked, his voice low and contemplative. "When all this is over, when we've taken down the last of Bellini's men, when the city is finally free, what happens then?" Mariana looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "We rebuild," she said softly. "We start over, not just for us, but for everyone who's been caught in the crossfire. There's a lot of work to do." Isabel, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "And we do it together. We can't change everything overnight, but we can make sure the next generation doesn't have to face what we did. Lucian nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Together, he agreed. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight of the world seemed to lift, just a little. They had made it through the worst of it, but they knew that their journey was far from finished. The city was changing, and with each passing day, the darkness that had once seemed so all-consuming was beginning to recede. The power that Bellini had held over them had shattered, and now it was their time to rise. In the days that followed, they worked tirelessly to dismantle the remnants of Bellini's empire. But unlike their previous efforts, this time there was hope. The people they had once feared now stood with them, and together, they began to rebuild the city that had been ravaged by corruption and violence. But even in the midst of this fragile peace, Mariana knew that the fight for justice would never truly end. The world was full of shadows, and there would always be those who sought to exploit them. But she was no longer afraid. They had taken the first steps towards something better, and she would continue to walk this path, with Lucian and Isabel by her side, ready for whatever came next. Their journey had begun with fear, betrayal, and loss, but it had transformed into something greater, something more powerful than they could have ever imagined. And as they looked toward the future, they knew one thing for certain. As long as they had each other, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The whispers of sin that had once threatened to destroy them had been silenced. And now, the echoes of their victory would ring in the city for years to come. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, as Mariana, Lucian, and Isabel continued their mission to erase the last vestiges of Bellini's empire. The city, which had once felt like a prison of fear and uncertainty, began to show signs of life again, of possibility. It was no longer the corrupt, broken place it had been under Bellini's iron rule. But the scars remained, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be healed. Mariana spent her days speaking with those who had lived in the shadow of Bellini's tyranny. Some had been loyal to him out of fear, others out of necessity. But now they found themselves at a crossroads, unsure of how to navigate the world without the figure they had once feared. Mariana spoke to them not with anger, but with understanding. She had been in their shoes, caught between survival and morality. Her words resonated with them, giving them hope for a future they hadn't dared to imagine. Lucian, ever the protector, focused on training a new generation of leaders, those who would not fall into the same traps that had ensnared Bellini's followers. His voice was a steady force, offering guidance and wisdom to those willing to listen. He was building something that would outlast them, all a network of people who would be prepared to lead, not with fear, but with courage and integrity. Isabel, with her sharp mind and keen insight, took charge of the city's infrastructure, helping to repair the broken systems that Bellini had left in shambles. It was a daunting task, but she thrived on the challenge. With every corner of the city that was rebuilt, she saw a glimpse of what it could become, a place where justice, not corruption, would reign. But despite the progress they were making, there were still those who wished to reclaim the power Bellini had once held. His allies, though scattered, were not easily deterred. They whispered in the shadows, regrouping in secret, waiting for the right moment to strike. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of red and gold, Mariana and Lucian stood together on the rooftop of their safe house, looking out over the city. "We've come so far," Mariana said quietly, her voice tinged with both exhaustion and pride. But I can't shake the feeling that there's more to be done. There are still pieces of Bellini's empire that haven't been touched. We've uprooted so much of it, but not all of it. Lucian's gaze remained fixed on the horizon, his face shadowed by the weight of their journey. We've made more progress than I thought possible. But you're right. There's still work to be done. Bellini's influence may be gone, but the ideals he represented, those ideals are far from eradicated. Mariana felt the weight of his words. She had known, deep down, that even if they defeated Bellini, the underlying corruption, the darkness that allowed men like him to rise, wouldn't vanish overnight. The city needed more than just their efforts. It needed a transformation, a change in how people thought, how they lived. It was not enough to remove the tyrant from the throne. They had to ensure that no one else could take his place. And yet, with every passing day, it felt like they were closer. Mariana could feel it in the way the people around her had begun to change. The fear that had once gripped them was slowly giving way to something else. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, their city could be more than just a place of survival. It could be a place of freedom. We'll get there, Lucian said, his voice low but determined. One step at a time. We've taken down the man who held the city hostage. Now, we need to make sure his legacy doesn't survive. And that's going to take time. But we'll see it through. Mariana nodded. She could hear the truth in his words. It was going to take everything they had, every ounce of strength, every shred of hope, but they could do it. Together. As the weeks turned into months, the foundation they had laid began to grow. The city began to change, not in leaps and bounds, but in small, incremental steps. The people who had once been silent now found their voices. The institutions that had been corrupted began to rebuild, bit by bit. And all the while, Mariana, Lucian, and Isabel remained steadfast, ensuring that the work they had started would not be in vain. But in the depths of their work, a new danger began to emerge, one that they had not anticipated. Bellini's most loyal followers, those who had built their lives around his vision, had begun to regroup. They were no longer content to remain in the shadows. They were organizing, planning, and preparing to challenge the fragile peace that had begun to settle over the city. It wasn't long before they made their move. One evening, as Mariana and Lucian sat in a small cafe, discussing their plans for the coming weeks, Isabel's voice came through the communicator they had set up for emergencies. "It's happening," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "They've made their move. The remnants of Bellini's organization have gathered. They're coming for us, for everything we've built." Mariana's heart skipped a beat, the realization that they had not yet seen the end of the struggle hit her with a cold force. She turned to Lucian, whose expression had hardened in an instant. They had known this day might come, but that didn't make it any less real. "How many?" Lucian asked, his voice steady despite the tension. "Enough to cause trouble," Isabel replied. "I've already moved most of our people into position, but we need to act fast. If they strike now, it could set us back months, even years." Mariana stood up, her decision made in an instant. "Then we strike first. We go after their leaders. If we break their command, we break their power. Lucian nodded, his eyes fierce. Let's end this. For good. The final confrontation came swiftly, and it was more brutal than any of them had anticipated. The remnants of Bellini's empire were not the same as they had once been. They were desperate, fueled by the memory of the power they had lost, and willing to do anything to reclaim it. But Mariana, Lucian, and Isabel were ready. They had faced death and survived. They had faced betrayal and fought back. This time, they would face their past once and for all and emerge victorious. The battle was long, fierce, and unforgiving. But when the dust settled, it was clear that the remnants of Bellini's empire had been shattered for good. The leaders who had once been the lifeblood of his organization were either captured or eliminated, and with them, the last vestiges of Bellini's legacy faded into the shadows where they belonged. For the first time in years, the city felt truly free. The people, no longer living in the shadow of fear, began to rebuild their lives in earnest. They were no longer bound by the chains of a corrupt regime. And as the sun rose over the city, casting its golden light on a new day, Mariana, Lucian, and Isabel stood together, knowing that their fight had brought them here to the dawn of a new beginning. They had survived. They had overcome. And they had won. Though the remnants of Bellini's empire had crumbled, and the city had begun to heal from the scars of its past, there were still challenges on the horizon. The people, while relieved from the constant threat of violence, now faced a different kind of battle, the battle for the soul of their city. The fight for justice was far from over, and with every victory, the burden of leadership grew heavier for Mariana, Lucian, and Isabel. The first few weeks after the final confrontation were filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment. The streets, once riddled with tension and danger, now seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. People ventured into the markets, children played in the streets, and the city felt as though it had reclaimed some semblance of normalcy. Yet, for the three of them, the work was far from over. Isabel had been the first to recognize that the city needed more than just physical rebuilding. It needed a new moral compass, a system that could ensure such corruption would never rise again. With Bellini gone, the gaps in leadership were vast. It was clear that a new order had to be established, one grounded in transparency, fairness, and justice. Isabel met with the former city officials who had once been under Bellini's thumb. Many were hesitant, reluctant to accept that their position in the world had changed. But through diplomacy and persuasion, she began to rebuild the city's government, slowly replacing the corrupt officials with those who shared her vision of reform. She worked tirelessly to set up checks and balances, ensuring that power would no longer be concentrated in the hands of a few. Mariana, meanwhile, took it upon herself to work with the people. She began holding forums, listening to their concerns, and offering a platform for those whose voices had been silenced under Bellini's reign. It was an exhausting task, but one that she believed would ultimately give the people the power to shape their own future. She knew that if they were to move forward, they would need to feel ownership of the city's future. No one could truly lead without the trust of those they served. Lucian, always the protector, focused on rebuilding the city's security and defense. He worked with the new leaders to create a network of community-based security forces that could ensure peace, without falling into the traps of violence or authoritarian control. He was determined to make sure that the weapons Bellini had once used to terrorize the population would never again be used for oppression. Despite their progress, the shadow of Bellini's influence still loomed large. His followers, though scattered, had not given up. They lurked in the corners of the city, waiting for the right moment to make their move. And even as the city began to rebuild, a sense of unease lingered in the air. One evening, as Mariana and Lucien sat in the small safe house they had established as their base of operations, Isabel entered, her face tight with worry. "They're not gone," she said, her voice low. "I've been hearing rumors. There are still pockets of resistance, small but growing. Some of Bellini's former allies are regrouping. And they're not just waiting for a chance to strike. They're planning something." Lucien stood immediately, his face hardening. "How many?" "Too many to ignore," Isabel replied. "We've been trying to track their movements, but they've been careful. They're using the chaos of the city's rebuilding efforts as cover." Mariana felt a surge of frustration. It seemed like no matter how many battles they won, there was always another to face. But she knew, deep down, that this was the nature of their struggle. Victory didn't mean the end. It meant the beginning of something new. Something that had to be protected. "We can't let them rebuild what Bellini started," she said, her voice firm. "We need to act before they gain any more ground." Lucien nodded, his resolve clear. "We'll find them. We'll stop them." The weeks that followed were filled with tension. Their every move was calculated, every decision weighed carefully. They worked with their allies, infiltrating Bellini's old networks and trying to uncover the identities of those still loyal to his cause. But the enemy was elusive, operating in the shadows, always one step ahead. One night, as the city slept, Isabel returned to their safe house with crucial information. She had uncovered a secret meeting, a gathering of Bellini's former associates, hidden in the underbelly of the city. This was their chance, their opportunity, to finally rid the city of the last remnants of the old regime. "Tomorrow night," Isabel said, her eyes intense. "They'll be there. We strike then." The night was dark, the streets eerily quiet as the three of them made their way through the winding alleys, preparing for the final confrontation. Lucien moved with silent precision, his eyes scanning every corner, while Isabel led the way, her mind already calculating their next steps. Mariana's heart beat in her chest, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. This would be their last fight, the one that would finally purge the city of the darkness that had clung to it for so long. They reached the old warehouse where the meeting was to take place. The building was abandoned, but the sound of muffled voices from within told them that the remnants of Bellini's empire were there, plotting their next move. They waited for a moment, catching their breath, before Lucien gave the signal. Without a word, they moved in. The fight that ensued was brutal, but it was over quickly. They were no longer the same people who had first stepped into Bellini's world. They had grown, learned, and adapted. And now they were unstoppable. By the time the last of Bellini's loyalists were subdued, the building was silent, save for the heavy breathing of the trio. Their mission had been a success. The remnants of Bellini's influence had been crushed, and the city was once again free. In the days that followed, the city began to breathe a little easier. The final vestiges of Bellini's power were gone, and the people could finally rebuild without fear. Mariana, Lucien, and Isabel were hailed as heroes, but they knew that their work was far from finished. The road to true freedom, they realized, was long. but they had taken the first steps. Together, they had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. And now, they would see the city rise stronger, better, and free from the chains that had once held it captive. Their journey was just beginning. As the days turned into weeks, the city settled into a fragile peace. The streets were quieter, the markets busier, and the air itself seemed to carry a sense of hope. Yet, for Mariana, Lucian, and Isabel, there was always the understanding that peace, like power, could be fleeting. The work they had done was monumental, but the shadows of their past of Bellini's reign still lingered in ways they couldn't entirely erase. They knew the city's recovery required more than just removing the remnants of the old guard. It needed a new philosophy, a new way of thinking that could sustain it in the long term. Mariana had taken to spending her mornings meeting with the people, hearing their stories and discussing what they wanted for the future. Each conversation was a reminder that this was not just a matter of policy or laws. It was about rebuilding trust, about giving people the agency to shape their lives in a way that would ensure the horrors of the past never returned. She understood that while they had removed the head of the snake, the body was still writhing beneath the surface, and without a cultural shift, it was only a matter of time before the same cycle of corruption and oppression reared its ugly head again. But those who had lived under Bellini's rule knew the difference between fear and hope, and Mariana's voice, once just a whisper among the rebels, was now one they trusted. She didn't offer simple solutions or promises of an easy life. Instead, she challenged them to face the truth that the road to real change required effort, and it required honesty. Lucian, meanwhile, had become the city's rock. Where Mariana was the voice of change, Lucian was its protector. He worked tirelessly with the new security forces, ensuring that they were trained not just in combat, but in upholding justice and fairness. He believed in the importance of accountability, of ensuring that those who were given power, no matter how small, would be held to the highest standard. But even as they worked to build a new city, cracks began to appear in the foundation of their success. People were restless. They wanted change, and they wanted it now. The initial wave of optimism that had swept through the city began to fade, replaced by frustration as the slow pace of rebuilding took its toll. In their desire for a fresh start, the people were impatient, unsure of the long-term vision. Isabel, ever the strategist, saw the danger in this impatience. The more the city demanded change, the more vulnerable they became to those who would exploit that impatience for their own gain. "We can't afford to let the cracks widen," she said one evening as they gathered in the safe house, the weight of their growing responsibilities heavy in the air. "There are those who will prey on this frustration. We need to maintain the narrative, to keep the people focused on the long term." "You think there are people organizing against us?" Lucian asked, his tone serious. "I don't think we're done with Bellini's influence just yet," Isabel replied. "There are whispers of unrest in the poorer districts, of people dissatisfied with the pace of change. Some of them are calling for a return to a more authoritarian regime. They're not just asking for more power. They're asking for someone to take charge and make things happen quickly." Mariana frowned. "We can't go back to that. We can't let the city fall into the same pattern of fear and control." Lucian agreed. "We have to maintain the trust we've built. If we let them slip, we'll lose everything." Isabel's eyes narrowed with determination. "We need to be proactive. We can't wait for the storm to break. We need to find those who are stirring the pot before it's too late." That night, as the city slept beneath a canopy of stars, Isabel's instincts proved true. In the quietest corners of the city, a faction began to form, a coalition of disgruntled citizens, former Bellini loyalists, and even a few disillusioned leaders. They called themselves the Vanguard, and they were determined to restore the old order. They believed the city needed a strong hand, someone who would take charge and make the decisions, rather than waiting for slow reforms to take root. The Vanguard's message spread quickly. They had charisma, and they knew how to appeal to the people's frustrations. Freedom is not the luxury of endless debate. Their leader, a former lieutenant of Bellini's, declared in underground meetings, "It is the strength to seize what is ours. Only those who take control will ensure the city's survival." Word of the group reached Mariana, Lucian, and Isabel within days. It was clear they had a choice to make: to allow the vanguard to grow unchecked or to confront them before their influence spread further. Lucien was the first to call for action. "If we don't stop them now, we'll face a war on two fronts, one with the vanguard and one with the city itself. As we lose the people's trust." Mariana nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of what needed to be done. "We fought for this city. We can't let it slip back into the hands of those who would use fear to control it." "I'll handle the vanguard," Isabel said, determination in her voice. "I know their tactics. I know how they operate." The three of them made a plan. This time, they weren't just fighting to rid the city of Bellini's legacy. They were fighting to protect the fragile freedom they had fought so hard to achieve. The days leading up to their confrontation were filled with tension. Mariana met with community leaders, urging them to hold firm, to resist the lure of those promising swift change. Lucian worked with the security forces, ensuring they were prepared for the coming conflict, while Isabel used her network to infiltrate the vanguard and gather critical intelligence. On the night they decided to strike, the city was eerily quiet. It felt as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The vanguard's headquarters, a hidden building on the outskirts of the city, was heavily guarded, but Isabel knew how to move unseen. With Lucien by her side and Mariana coordinating from a distance, they infiltrated the base. The battle was swift, but not without its casualties. The vanguard fought fiercely, convinced they were fighting for the city's future. But in the end, it was clear they had underestimated the unity of those who had fought for freedom. When the last of the vanguard was subdued, Mariana stood at the heart of the operation. She had seen the fear and desperation in the eyes of the people who had joined the group, and she knew that, in the end, they had only sought a quicker resolution to the suffering that had plagued them. They had been lost, looking for someone to lead them out of the darkness, that they had been misguided. "We won't be ruled by fear again," Mariana whispered, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. The city slowly returned to its new rhythm. The vanguard had been dismantled, but their ideals had not disappeared. The fight for freedom was never truly over. Every generation would have to fight to protect what they had built. Mariana, Lucian, and Isabel, standing together once more, knew their work would never be done, that they had created something worth protecting. They had faced the darkness, and they had emerged victorious. Together, they would continue to guide the city, ensuring it stayed true to the lessons they had learned, the lessons of courage, justice, and the unyielding power of hope. The weeks turned into months, and as time passed, the three of them, the tireless champions of change, began to notice something beautiful unfolding. The people of the city, though wary at first, had started to believe in their own power again. The the flames of corruption had not been completely extinguished, that the fire had been contained. What had once seemed an insurmountable battle against the tide of history was now a story of perseverance, resilience, and hope. Mariana continued to lead with her unwavering faith in the people. She spent countless hours in the marketplace, in the community halls, listening, advising, and leading by example. It was clear to everyone that her commitment was not one of empty promises, but of hard work and sacrifice. She helped the people understand that true freedom wasn't a gift. It was something they all had to earn and protect together. Lucien, ever the protector, had become a symbol of strength and justice. His leadership in the security forces was marked not by the force of his fists, but by his ability to inspire trust and respect. He taught his officers to be more than enforcers of law. They were guardians of the city's values. In his eyes, power didn't lie in domination. It was in the protection of those who couldn't protect themselves. His was a quiet strength that moved through the city like a steady current, keeping it from tipping over into chaos. Isabel, the strategist, had become the architect of the city's future. She led the formation of an independent council, a diverse group of citizens, representing the full spectrum of the city's population. This council, unlike the ones before it, was not led by self-interests or shadowed by the power of one man. It was a body of voices, each contributing their perspective, each helping to shape a collective future. In her quiet, determined way, Isabel had shifted the focus of power from the few to the many. She had set up systems of accountability and transparency that made corruption far harder to take root. The city was slowly rebuilding not just its physical structures but its very soul, brick by brick, with integrity at its foundation. Yet, despite their successes, the three of them could never forget the deeper truth that had motivated their every action, the truth that had guided them through the darkness and into the light, that no victory is ever final unless the hearts of the people are healed, and no peace is everlasting unless it is built on a foundation of understanding, love, and shared responsibility. One evening, as they stood together overlooking the city from the highest tower, they spoke of the journey they had shared. The city below was bathed in the soft golden glow of the setting sun, and for a moment, it seemed like the past had become nothing more than a distant memory. "You know," Mariana began, her voice thoughtful, "we've been fighting for so long. It's hard to remember what peace feels like sometimes." Lucien, standing beside her, nodded. "I think we're all still learning how to live in it. But that's what makes it worth fighting for, right? Peace isn't something you achieve. It's something you build, something you live." Isabel smiled quietly, her eyes scanning the city below. "And it's something that requires constant care. It's fragile, but so long as we remember why we fight, we'll always have something to protect." Mariana's gaze softened, her heart swelling with an emotion she had only recently come to fully understand. "I think we've learned the most important lesson of all. The true strength of a city, of any people, is not in the walls they build or the laws they enforce. It's in their ability to care for one another, to hold each other up when the world gets heavy. Without that, everything else falls apart." Lucien's smile was quiet, but it held the weight of years of struggle. "And we've learned, perhaps, that we're all capable of more than we think. We're capable of creating something better if we're willing to sacrifice, to work, to keep going even when it seems impossible." Isabel's voice was soft, but resolute. "True power doesn't come from taking what you want. It comes from giving something meaningful to others, from working together, with kindness, with integrity, and with a commitment to justice. That's how we rebuild. They stood there for a moment in silence, each lost in the quiet beauty of the city stretching out before them. The light of the setting sun casting a soft, golden glow over the buildings and streets. The sounds of life, a song of laughter, of children playing, of conversations flowing in the distance, reminded them of what they had fought for, what they had nearly lost, and what they had now earned. A future built on hope, shared values, and the belief that true strength comes from the unity of the people.